So in addition to natural selection, we have things like genetic drift and gene flow that can contribute to evolution. So genetic drift is a change in the gene pool due to chance, and it can alter the allele frequencies in the population where you can actually have alleles lost out. And in that population genetics lab that I kind of keep referring back to, the last case I mentioned earlier in a previous lecture recording that I would have had you possibly do some inbreeding. I would put you in small groups of 3 or 4 and basically cause you to have to uh, when you become your own child, you'd have to mate with a sibling, or at least as a grandchild, you have to mate back to a, you know, uncle or cousin or something. So, what would be called that if you were human in that scenario. But anyway, that's to point out the possibility of losing a trait, an allele. And usually in that lab, some of the groups will lose either the dominant allele or the recessive allele out of their small population, their small isolated population. That's basically where you have like what's called the bottleneck effect. It's that something has drastically reduced the population size, and because of the size being so small, we lose gene variability out. We lose these possible either dominant or recessive alleles, um, and that's not desirable. When species get into that small population, scientists get very worried about them because they're on the edge of extinction. And even if they're brought back from the edge of extinction, then the gene pool is still very narrow. And depending on what kind of genes have been lost, what kind of alleles, what kind of variations of genes have been lost, that can make that species very vulnerable to an environmental change, a disease. Um, one little thing that seems very minor in the big picture could finish them off as far as the species goes. So even if there's thousands of individuals around, if they're all genetically identical, they don't have any variation to deal with a change. Okay. Um, Founder effect, colonization of a new location by a small number of individuals. It's very similar to the bottleneck effect in its outcome, just kind of the cause is different. Okay, here you have a bottleneck effect where a whole bunch of the species dies off for some reason, and the few that are left are very much the same genetically. And here's where you just have a few who are very much the same genetically, uh, move to a new location and only mate with each other. Okay, so again, you still have inbreeding basically going on and loss of alleles. Okay, example of bottlenecking. Notice that like only the purple and one green survive and all the orange are lost and most of the green, and chances are good that the green allele will get lost, okay, out of this population in a few generations. You won't have any green individuals at all. They'll all be purple. Okay, doesn't have to happen. Just chances are good. Um, Yeah, I'm going to let you read some of these slides here. Endangered species, I just kind of mentioned that, lost genetic variability. Um, I've already talked about mutations, I think. Um, okay, this is our showing recombination. Actually, this is showing gamete production. Okay, this individual can only give this type of gamete for this trait, the red trait. This individual carries the trait for both red, or not red, for yellow and green. And so it could pass on either yellow or green. Okay, so it's just kind of showing how an organism that's heterozygous can produce 2 different types of gametes, or gametes with 2 different allele possibilities, whereas a homozygote will only be able to produce gamete with 1 possibility. And then, of course, if they mate with each other, then the resulting offspring have variability. Okay, new combinations of alleles. Okay, so that's something you've probably seen in lab. Fingerprints are very individual, but the base pattern I think is inherited, and then after that, it's environmental that causes everybody's to be different. You can read that. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. Natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms. Okay, and that's something from the very beginning with the Cosmos film. Carl Sagan was saying that we could probably, if we picked and choose what we picked and chose, what we think would be the best for each allele set, we could craft, engineer an organism far superior to anything that's ever existed because it would be directed. And this is nature's random chance. Okay. Um, so natural selection is an editing process. It's not goal oriented, and it's not toward making the most perfect, eventually the most perfect specimen of that species. It's about what survives at that moment. Okay. It edits what is needed for that moment and edits out what isn't needed for that moment or what's detrimental even to that moment. Okay. In time. So yeah, and here are the 4 reasons. You can see those. Okay. Adaptations are often compromises. Something good is lost in exchange for something else that's good for that situation. Okay. Something that was an advantage in the past but isn't as critical now can get lost in exchange for something else. And it's not a purposeful exchange. It's just how things worked. Okay. So it's only in editing, and that's been a test question from the very beginning of this semester. To have you know that from very first chapter 1 reading about artificial selection and natural selection, and in the film, of course, is natural selection is an editing process. I'm going to skip the mosquito mystery. You can go look that up if you want. Here's definitions. These are definitions for you to read, know, understand. So when I use the words on test questions, you know what we're talking about. Family tree, phylogeny type tree, we've seen these before. Is this divergence of these two birds from an ancestor. Idea, taxonomy. I've talked about taxonomy before. I haven't actually given you, I don't think, a slide presentation on it. So here is the definition, a little history briefly there for you to have reference to. Yeah, in normal class time, I spend some time talking about this, but I don't want to do that here because I'm trying to abbreviate all this material down. So we're going to skip these slides here a little bit. Reproductive isolation is right here. This is where I'm heading next. This is the next thing I really want to get talked about. Okay, so these other concepts. So I have my definition of species that I gave you back at the beginning in red, not the beginning, but back over here, way back over here. There we go, in red. That's the species definition we're using for this class. There are people who say we need to have a more inclusive definition for other situations, and that's the morphological species concept, the ecological species concept, the phylogenetic species concept. Me personally, I think they muddy the water. I like the idea that if it can't breed and reproduce a viable offspring, then they're not the same species. Okay, because if you start telling me that morphology differences mean they're a different species. That's partly why this is in here. Actually, it's out of the book with the presentation. It's like well, there's some morphology differences there, aren't we? But we don't have 6 different species. We got, or at least there's least phenotypical differences. We've got 1 species there. Okay, so I think it gets kind of confusing or muddies the water a little bit. Ecological niche. Okay, well, we got vegetarian versus omnivore, or if you that's a choice people make, right? Not always. Some people actually have medical reasons why they have to be vegetarian. If they have had issues with digesting, their body doesn't produce certain proteins, they can't digest meat, they have to be vegetarian. So it's not a choice. But in many cases, it's a choice. But that is an ecological role difference. How you impact the environment around you based on what you eat. So again, that muddies the water a lot. But they're not, I don't think they're looking at specific. They're kind of, you got to combine. I think they're thinking you got to combine some of those different concepts to determine whether you've got a new species or not. And even if they don't reproduce to produce a viable offspring, they might still be the same species if they've got some of those other similarities. I don't know. Anyway, I like I said, I like the other one because it's very testable. You can test it. 2 organisms, they reproduce or they don't reproduce. The offspring's viable or not. That's testable. Okay. So reproductive barriers that can prevent 2 species or 2 organisms from breeding with each other, even though they might. You could stick them in a laboratory or artificially inseminate, take sperm from the male and inseminate the female, they would produce offspring. and it would live. It's viable, but in the wild, you don't find these things doing that. And then over time, the idea is that over time, the genetic variability will actually make it such that they can't reproduce. But even with ones today where you could still do this, why don't they? Why don't they cross in nature? And here's why: we have some things called pre-zygotic barriers. Pre means before, and zygote means when the egg and sperm unite and form the first cell, the zygote. So things that prevent fertilization, prevent the egg from being fertilized by the sperm. Okay, pre-zygotic barriers. And so one is temporal isolation. Species breed at different times, and that's the metalarks here. I think these are metalarks, eastern and western, I believe, if I'm right. Um, oh gosh, it's been a while since I've read this. May and June, I think. One is ready to reproduce in May, the other one's not ready until June. So even in areas of kind of Mississippi River, the west side of the Mississippi River area where they overlap in their territories, um, they're not going to breed with each other because one's not ready when the other one is. Okay, so that's a temporal um, isolation. Behavioral isolation, I like to use this one, the blue-footed booby. Silly name. That's what it means. Back in the older days, a boob was not a reference to, it's not a crude reference to anatomy. It was a word for a silly person, or it meant clown, kind of a boob, such a boob. Okay, so people who first observed these thought that they were silly in their mating dance. Their mating dance looked kind of funny. Uh, and it's pretty complicated from what I've seen. I haven't studied it or anything along those lines, but one bird does one part and then the other bird takes it up and does the next and then the next, and if you don't do the dance right, you don't get to mate. Okay, so that's very definite behavior. Okay, and there's a red-footed booby too, I think, and these are two skunks. One is a checkerboard pattern and the other's a spiral pattern. Don't know if you can see that, but again, they meet each other, they're not going to mate because it's like, you don't look right. Okay, good behavior also I think is out there because they're a good as an example of behavioral isolation. um, Mechanical isolation is where the female and male sex organs or gametes are just not compatible. um, it's kind of a physical thing. Either the male and female just physically cannot mate, or if they can mate, um, there's something wrong with the way the egg and the sperm have to come into contact with each other that just doesn't happen. Okay, so that's a mechanical isolation. And then gametic isolation is after copulation, after the sex act. The gametes do not unite to form a zygote, and there can be lots of reasons for that. Um, Actually, in my understanding of most animal species at least, is that the vaginal fluid of a female, okay, has because I say most animals, so I got to say the guy have a vagina first. Okay, anyway, the fluid is it's got chemicals in it that uh, will kill sperm that is of another species. Okay, and it also, I mean, the chemicals are there as a part of the immune system in a sense. They kill bacteria, they kill any type of cell that's not supposed to be there. So um, cells of the same species would have evolved the way to tolerate that or be compatible to that. And um, so if you've got a different species, then they're going to uh, you know, fall victim to that defense. So that's one um, way that this gametic isolation works out. Okay, so that the sperm just can't survive if it's not the right species. Post-zygotic barriers, okay, operate after hybrid zygotes are formed. So yeah, hybrid. We're talking about hybrid. This is like, we did the horse and the mule to get horse and the donkey to get a mule. Sorry, or any other such crossing of different species to get a hybrid, something in between. But we have hybrid inviability, and when that happens, the hybrid doesn't survive. The embryo may develop to a certain point and then be naturally aborted. It may be born, but be born dead. It may be born and only live for a short while after birth, um, that sort of thing. Then we have hybrid sterility, where the hybrid organism is born, but it can't reproduce on its own. Can't make, can't reproduce. Either it doesn't produce eggs, or it doesn't produce sperm, or it doesn't produce enough of either of those very often, so that the likelihood of being fertilized is so low that it's not going to happen. Where the eggs and the sperm it does produce, whichever gender it would be, are so low quality. They're not able to survive well. Okay. Um, yeah. So we have that, and then we have hybrid breakdown. The hybrids that mate with each other, or either parent species, produce a feeble or sterile offspring. So you may have where the offspring, the hybrid itself, can reproduce with another hybrid, does produce eggs and sperm, can reproduce, but then again, you've got uh, the the resulting offspring there are either inviable like the first, or sterile like the second. Okay. Um, so you've got one generation that seems good, but then the next generation's not. Okay. They look at this, they think maybe this was part of where, Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man mated with each other. It appears we find remains now of what looks like hybrids. And they're thinking that they first said, well, it's hybrid sterility, and not sure about that. Okay. Uh, because it appears now that we can find that there's Neanderthal genes in pretty much all humans. If you're of European ancestry, you might have a little bit higher percentage of some of those Neanderthal genes, but other parts of the world not so much. But it's like there, it's there. It's spread throughout the entire population. If we're targeting those right things as far as what they're flagging as Neanderthal sequences, and it's not a lot. It's a very small percentage overall anyway. But that would indicate that they weren't inviable, they weren't sterile. There might have been some hybrid breakdown, uh, but even with that, a few managed to pass offspring off to that made it back to the Cro-Magnon enough that eventually that those genes got carried into the population. But the idea that hybrid one generation of hybrid and the offspring were sterile doesn't seem to be holding up as the 100% occurrence anyway. All right, so that's post-zygotic. Post meaning after the zygote has formed. Okay, so that's why we're talking about these individuals. At least an embryo forms if nothing else, and can't survive, or you have an actual individual that can survive but doesn't pass on, can't reproduce very well. And of course, the standard textbook example is the horse and the donkey that can have a mule. I've read numerous accounts, though. I think I've read numerous accounts of the same occurrences, but this has been shown that a female mule that is kept with a stallion permanently, like her whole life, can actually reproduce at some point an offspring. It's usually a horse. I understand. Really, genetics. It's kind of a throwback to the horse parent. The explanation I read on that is that the female is very low virility. Okay, very low fertility rather. Get the males usually virile and females are fertile. Yeah. Okay. Um, they produce eggs, but they just don't produce them regularly or often. Okay, and that's why the constant companion of the stallion, which is a male horse, works, because he's there at the right time. If you try to catch her and figure out when she's ready to be bred and then put her with the horse, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss the window. But so that's why historically it just hasn't happened much. Um, and I think really where it has happened is where they've been doing studies to kind of try to see if it could happen. Okay. Um, so anyway, that may be, um, in a sense, a little bit of a myth that it can't happen, and but it's still a very, very rare occurrence. Uh, but they're not. It's possible that the mule's not completely sterile as we thought. Okay, geographic barriers. I've kind of already alluded to this. I'm just gonna let you read that. Little idea about these little guys here on different sides of the Grand Canyon were once the same species. Now they're different today because as the cavern got wider, as the canyon got wider, they couldn't scamper across anymore. wider and deeper. And so the vegetation on the two sides actually is different, and they adapted more to their vegetation and the predators on the different sides. Okay. This is a fruit fly study, and you can read, the slides are very self-explanatory. You can read about this. It's kind of interesting about, you smell wrong. Okay, that's just that. Based on what they ate, the flies wouldn't mate with each other because they smelled wrong. And that's kind of right. I think that was what it was. Um, well, that was one of the ideas I read. If they eat different foods, their diet, they wouldn't mate with the fly from a different diet as easily, as readily. Um, and I think one of the speculations I read somewhere in connection to this was that they probably, the uh, metabolic chemicals given off from the different foods caused the fly to have a different chemical, uh, give off different chemical smell, possibly chemical signals, whatever. So I, I remember I read on that, kind of latched on the idea that they smelled wrong. Thought that was funny. Yeah, more about drift and pupfish, and just more examples of kind of the same stuff we've been going over. Um, this is talking about the polyploidy in plants a little bit. You've got tetraploid there. This is hollyhocks. This is we talk about Hugo de Vries. Yeah, um, this hollyhocks. Um, so polyploid plants are what we really rely on agriculturally, for food, for most of our food. Bread, the wheat we make bread out of is Triticum aestivum, and it's a polyploid. And it's here's a picture. This is kind of an interesting little thing I like to talk about. Probably the last thing I'll talk about. Yeah, probably. Okay. Um, what we know is that, I've mentioned we found grains of wheat in Egyptian tombs. We can date those to thousands of years ago. And we have the grain that they raised, which is, I believe, this one here, the emmer wheat. That's your biblical time, ancient time wheat. Um, and we know we've got some wild types that are still around out there. Okay, growing wild is kind of almost weeds because they have such few grains, they're not worth spending time harvesting. That's kind of why early on we got something different. We can tell by looking genetically at this that well, it was a sterile hybrid, okay, of these two. But with a meiotic error, okay, because it carries these genes, is what it is. What we did is we have um, two diploid plants mated to make a sterile hybrid of ABB, or AB, sorry, just AB, one chromosome from each parent. That did a self on itself, okay, self-fertilized, and obviously didn't do meiosis completely, or at all. And we've got doubling of the chromosomes. So that's your meiotic error. And that winds up with AABB, and that gives you the emmer wheat. Okay. Then if we cross it, if it winds up crossing, or humans crossed it, or crosses in the wild, either way, with Triticum tauschii, this is another wild type of wheat. Okay. Then we get A and B from this parent and D from that parent, which again is a sterile hybrid at 21 chromosomes. Another meiotic error in self-fertilization going on, where we have selfing without meiosis separation, meiotic separation, and we're going to get doubling of the chromosome to where we have today's um, triploid wheat, AABBDD. Okay, and this is our 42 chromosome bred wheat today. That's what we grow and raise. Variations of, but still it's the same genus and species, just different breeds and varieties of it. Okay, but that's its genetic history, and it's kind of right there in the genome. You can see where it goes back to these wild types. And then with the finds of wheat grains preserved in uh, the Middle East and Egypt, we've got genetic evidence of this one. This one may still be grown some in the Middle East. I don't know that for sure. Okay, I'm not. I know we've found old grains, and people have done genetic studies of those. So, okay, um, but That's plants. Plants can do different things than animals can do, like self-fertilize. Okay, and that's some of what has led to the polyploidy that we have. You can just read about all this. These two people are real interesting in their studies that they've done with the um, Darwin's finches, the different finches that have different beak shapes and sizes because they eat different things. Though they're genetically very similar, I've read that they can actually breed and reproduce. The offspring won't survive in the wild because the offspring is going to be born with like an intermediate beak that is not suited for any type of food available on the islands. And these are on different islands now because the islands have separated. And so you've got seed eaters, you got insect eaters, small seed eaters opposed to a large seed eater. Large seed. This one's got to poke down into that little cactus flower to get that seed down in there. So smaller seed. Yeah. So you can, like I said, read about that. Okay. So the tempo. This has been a point of contention again to close off here. Darwin's idea was really gradualism. The new species evolved gradually with these accumulated single mutations over time. Okay. And it's a slow thing, and then suddenly happens that something is beneficial, and so it's all there, and then um, we just see the slow change. Okay, uh, but it's all there when environmental selection comes along, and so part of the species slowly dies. But the rest, I mean, that phenotype was there. You saw it. You could find it in the fossil record idea. But the fossil record didn't support that. Um, we see most new species suddenly appearing, and they're similar to what came before, but they're different and maybe quite different. Excuse me. And we don't find sometimes the intermediary transitional forms that we think we should find if gradualism is going to happen. Um, so that led scientists to produce the idea of punctuated equilibrium, saying that there's periods of rapid evolutionary change and species being interrupted by long periods of little or no detectable change. And since not everything leads fossils and not all conditions, um, fossils happen at random times over long periods of time, that type of thing, that some of these rapid changes might not be recorded in the fossil record because it's the more established populations that are more likely to leave a fossil because the sheer amount of time uh, and commonality of a fossil. Um, and so what we actually think happens probably is a combination of the two. Okay, both models have merit. You've got some of that gradual change within a population that's going along and it's there, but it doesn't really mean anything because there's no pressure. Suddenly you get a change or a pressure like we had with our foraminifers, right? That small size had to be there or it wouldn't have been selected for and survived the catastrophe. Okay, if they'd all been large, all the foraminifers would have gone extinct, most likely. Okay, because all we saw that survived were the little ones. Okay, so that was a gradualism. Okay, gradually there were some that, well, they may have all started off small and gotten larger. Who knows? But that was a gradual change in the populations and everything of the different foraminifers, and then suddenly, boom, all the big ones are gone, and all we have now is little ones. Okay, so um, that's one of the areas of ideas. Another thing I've pointed out to you before that may actually lead to punctuated equilibrium is the idea that we're learning the role of viruses in evolutionary change. My biochemistry class that I took a few years back, that was some molecular genetics biochemistry, and that was pretty much the focus of a lot of the class was talking about how our coexistence with viruses have somewhat genetically engineered us almost over time, all species that get infected by viruses. Viruses can bring in chunks of sequences that can do things to us and maybe not. Okay. Yeah, obviously, COVID-19 can make us really sick, but oncogenes, talking about the fact that we think some oncogenes are brought, cancer causing genes are brought into a person from a viral infection. Okay. They may not even really gotten that sick with that virus, but it left the oncogenes behind in the cells. So this is an area of research that's going on. Again, learning more all the time, learning lots more all the time, I'm sure, than the few years it's been since I've had that class. There's probably a lot more that they found out that I don't know about to tell you. Um, but it was fascinating. Okay, and as we find that role, then that speeds up the time required for evolution to occur. If you get, instead of relying upon a base mutation, a single mutation here and there, randomly, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, only the good ones are going to survive, maybe it gets passed on, maybe it doesn't, until the right situation comes along and selects for it. And yeah, instead of just one, you can have segments of genes brought in. That that changes the whole timeline possibility. Okay. What was that? Yeah. So you can, again, you can read those last few slides and get the information off that. I don't need to elaborate on them any more than what they already say. Okay, so that is mechanisms of evolution, and that will end this topic. Last thing will be animal kingdom, and that will do it for the semester.